Hello, this is Dr. Matthew Skinta. I'm speaking to you from Chicago, Illinois, in the United States right now. It's an honor to have been invited to give this talk, and I will be joining you in real time after the video stops so that we'll have a chance to speak a little more and I can answer any questions that may have come up during it. So I'm going to share my screen where I have some slides I've prepared for this talk. So I'll be talking about psychotherapy for sexual and gender minority stress, a process-based CBT and transdiagnostic targets. In my view, I think one of the things that's left both a wonderful legacy, but also leaves a lot to be desired in the field is that around the world there's been a large emphasis on affirmative care, on affirmative psychotherapy. Essentially, can we provide treatment that allows lesbian, gay, pan, asexual, transgender, gender non-binary clients to feel comfortable, feel that we're not pathologizing their experiences or judging them, and also provide a safe environment for them to explore themselves and explore challenges in daily life. I'd really like to make an argument for thinking a little further than that, for pushing past that I think we have a literature now that has allowed us to gain some insights into what the particular challenges are that are posed by living in a world with bias and how therapy can accommodate that. So I'll start just a moment with the global context, sort of where are we all now? This is an internationally delivered speech, and it's important to consider that the world is so interconnected, and particularly when we think about and talk about civil rights movements or human rights movements, when we think about the LGBT community, where asylum seeking, refugee status, voluntary migration have always been heavy parts of our history as a community, and it makes for a small world. So I'll talk about the global context. I'll touch on structural limitations to an evidence-based approach to minority stress therapies. So what I mean by that is, why don't we already know everything I'm proposing we do? I'll touch on the scientific foundations and identification of common factors that we need to think about in therapy. And then the idea of process-based CBT, which at least in the United States has been growing as an area of focus, and how this proposes a model we might consider trying on to move forward. What particular contextual behavioral models that I practice might serve as solutions as we begin to conduct more research in this area. So we know that when we look at human rights for SGM people around the globe, they're under attack. I have this global map here by the International LGBT Association, and you can see that while there are a number of parts of the world where there have been advances, there are still nations where death penalties exist. There are still nations that criminalize or pathologize queer and trans experiences. And there's also a resurgence in many parts of the world, though it's very poorly documented and it's hard to attach numbers, of a rise of sexual orientation or gender identity change efforts, what has often been colloquially called in the US conversion therapy. So the good news is that Argentina has had marriage equality for a decade now, over a decade, and has some of the most advanced LGBTQ rights laws in the world. Argentina's really been a leader. There was a 2015 survey by a popular dating website, Planet Romeo, that found that Argentinian gay men were the second happiest in Latin America, right after Uruguay. So there's some good news in this. On the other hand, having traveled around much of the world, having been to Buenos Aires, there are differing degrees of visibility you see in the community of how out people are, things like that vary quite a bit. So there's documentation that gender minority discrimination, so particularly the treatment of trans people, still involves a lot of discrimination in Argentina, although it's been improving. That bullying of minors is still pretty common, particularly bullying around their sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, this is also starting to change. Over the past few years, the government's made a lot of inroads and expanding on sex education and trying to ameliorate this. But it's always one step forward, two steps back when it comes to the progression of human rights for SGM people. I'm also recording this talk while COVID is still, the pandemic is still raging around the globe. I hope that it will have less an effect by the time you are hearing this, but it's worth considering that COVID has also inspired a number of anti-LGBTQ efforts. In Panama, Peru, and Bogota, Colombia, there were strict quarantine rules that designated shopping days by gender. So you would have, you know, one day women could shop, one day men could shop. But this wound up serving as a justification for police harassment and violence toward trans people, particularly toward transgender women. Now, while activists responded, and this did lead to rule changes after a week in Peru, after 1 month in Bogota, I haven't found good data on whether or not it's continued in Panama. Ulysses Rocateri, a young gay artist, activist in Belize, was detained for breaking curfew and beaten severely. Before his death days later, he attributed this, speaking from his hospital bed, to police violence while he was in custody. And he appeared to have believed that his attack was motivated by his activism around LGBT and HIV-related causes. In Hungary, so shifting over to Europe, President Viktor Orban was granted special powers by the parliament when they realized they could no longer meet in the midst of the pandemic, to allow him to rush through the proposal of certain types of laws. And so his first morning with these special powers and a package of laws that were promoted, one of them was to require that the sex assigned at birth on identification cards replaced gender. So you could no longer, for example, have an ID card or a passport that went from male to listing you as female, because it was no longer a gender marker of your current gender. It was only what was assigned at birth. You can also find examples of religious leaders across all faiths, so Catholic, Muslim, Hindu, blaming LGBTQ people and acceptance of LGBTQ people or allowance of marriage equality for the spread of the pandemic. I found examples on every continent except for Antarctica, really. And I'm sure if I had connections to Antarctica, I could have found an example. So this is the context therapies happening in, right? Because we're only seeing our clients often 1 hour during the week. We don't really have the ability to shift the context away from this. This is what our clients are living when they walk into the room with us and they're beginning to share their experiences. So according to some research conducted within the US, most clinicians will have sexual and gender minority clients in the life of their practice, but they'll receive no special training at any point in time. And the literature in many countries emphasizes, as I said before, an affirmative approach, non-judgmental, unbiased, which is simply not treating a client disrespectfully or poorly. That doesn't seem the same as advancing the standard of care. And so when we think about behaviorism and cultural diversity, and from my experience with colleagues, the tradition of theoretical knowledge and training in Latin America is far superior to what many psychologists receive in the US. I often receive the argument that that behavioral therapies, that a functional analysis is already individual. I don't need to think about a group that a client is from if I'm already considering their specific life, the specific stimuli. And I like to refer to this article by Hayes and Tormino, where they wrote in 1995, cultural practices are behavioral events, and they're considered in terms of their prevalence in a population and analyzed in terms of contextual features that affect the social propagation and maintenance of these behaviors. Now, in more common speech, what this means is that we don't stop thinking functionally when we describe cultural differences. These are not approaches that are odds, but we consider that belonging to a group is a relevant context, that being informed about other groups gives us information about the stimulus value of our own identity, experiences that our clients may have. And so the experience of expressing your gender in a way society punishes, or expressing same sex attraction that are responded to by others, these are social consequences that our clients have been exposed to, and that learning history is what they're bringing into the room with us. So there are structural limitations as well in terms of what we can glean from the science that's out there. Now, cognitive and behavioral therapies have undergone a pretty long period over the past few decades of a heavy reliance on the development of RCTs, randomized controlled trials. And RCTs in the existing literature, per a recent review, almost never report on outcomes, much less participation rates even, of gender and sexual minority participants. So what this means is that when you're looking at an RCT, we have no ability to know for sure whether or not LGBT people have been a part of them, and if they were, if it worked as well. We do know that the treatment literature and the small number of RCTs that have been conducted historically, many with gay men living with HIV, have emphasized the role of HIV and HIV risk. There's only one randomized controlled trial currently that specifically targeted minority stress, which I'll speak more about in a moment, as an underlying condition to treat. And this was still funded through an HIV prevention mechanism through the National Institutes of Health in the US. And so it was inclusive only of gay and bisexual identified cisgender men who were perceived in some way to be at risk for HIV. So nearly 3/4 of the funding in the US that is designated or labeled as going towards sexual and gender minority research actually targets HIV prevention work instead. Similarly, when you look at funding sources, particularly here in the US, sexual and gender minority people are inconsistently treated as either a population with health disparities or excluded from funding for research or interventions for individuals within groups with health disparities. So do we have a need? It's one thing to say we have no science there. It's another to say, well, is there a need? Well, we do know that sexual and gender minority individuals are subjected to broad, well-documented health disparities, both psychological and medical health disparities. There are studies demonstrating the efficacy of non-adapted treatment, meaning treatment as usual, as well as novel treatments, such as Gary Diamond's work based off attachment-based family therapy, looking at familial rejection of LGBT family members. Now, that's treating something that's unique and specific for sexual and gender minorities. But the differences may be even more pronounced for individuals who experience greater minority stress. So even in studies that suggest that you get the same outcome to non-adaptive treatment, there are some limited examples, like the Beard study I mentioned here, where some sexual minority individuals, particularly bisexual individuals in this study, reported greater symptoms, lower treatment satisfaction after therapy. So these results are all buried when we don't actually know the identities of who's taking part in our trials. So I've made reference to minority stress a number of times at this point, and particularly for those of you who do work with sexual and gender minorities, this is probably something you know well. But minority stress theory suggests that there's no single line of discrimination that tells us everything we need to know or allows us to predict the effect of discrimination on individuals. Societal stigma pervades all of society. So this theory, as popularized by Myers, says we really have to look at the most internal, the most proximal to the most distal, the furthest out experiences. So we begin with self-stigma, internalized homophobia, internalized transphobia, internalized biphobia, and then stigma, or the expectation of rejection. So regardless of whether or not I believe negative things I hear in the world, knowing that they're out there, knowing that other people may have negative views about my sexual orientation or my gender identity, leads me to be more interpersonally guarded, emotionally armored, and interpersonally distant. Outness is used less in North America and Europe, parts of Europe and Australia now, because it's become so common that people are out. So newer research emphasizes concealment, or how much effort am I actually having to put into hiding my sexual orientation? That's a stressor. Next, we get to the fully external factors like discrimination, violence, prejudicial encounters with people out in the world, completely unrelated to my behavior. And then we have community connectedness. So there's starting to be an emphasis in the minority stress literature on not only the vulnerabilities, but also aspects of resilience. And community connectedness is by far the most researched of these. We know that these are related, particularly when you assess the full domain of minority stress factors, that they're related to a broad domain or a broad range of psychological factors. Now, one model is that these are due to reducing emotional regulation. That is an underlying trait we all have. Emotion regulation gets chipped away at with each act of discrimination, with each fearful moment where we don't want to disclose a part of ourselves because the environment doesn't suggest it's safe, or our learning history has led us to believe that the environment isn't safe. All of these chip away at our emotion regulation skills, which then, depending on our context, put us at risk for all sorts of adverse outcomes. For example, some studies in the US show that this might lead to greater panic and anxiety disorders for gay men, greater depression or suicidality for bisexual men, greater alcohol use for bisexual women, or depression with lesbians. Now, many other diagnoses can be elevated in the presence of minority stress, but these are some of the patterns that have been observed in some studies. And then, of course, when we start talking about gender minority individuals, rates of violence and discrimination are so overt that it's difficult to really capture the full weight of it. Michael Hendricks and Rai Testa a few years back, or 8 years back now, published a work where they were looking at this minority stress model and wanting to test it against a much larger sample of gender minority individuals, transgender and gender nonconforming or non-binary people, to see if these factors hung together the same way. Does this still mean the same thing? In part driven by what I was just mentioning about these outrageous levels of violence, sexual assault, murder, and knowing that others within your community are murder, acts of violence that are worsened by experiencing police mistreatment when reporting them. And what they found, what Hendricks and Testa found, were that the model more or less hung together the same. So what I've done here, when you look at this model, is you can see, I color-coded the trans-specific ones. So you can see that added to the stressors, we also have misgendering. So when an individual is aware of your gender identity, and they continue to use pronouns associated with the sex assigned at birth, as opposed to your gender, as well as pride as an additional source of resilience. So those were the two unique contributions that the Hendricks and Testa work added to the model. I've added self-compassion with a dotted line because while there are a growing number of studies on both gender and sexual minorities showing how important self-compassion is, it's not typically included in other speakers' lists on the impact. So within emotion dysregulation, I also added, we're talking about shame, we're talking about volatile relationships, all of the impacts that lead to adverse psychological, logical, and physiological outcomes. And so one approach when looking at this model is to say, well, if it's all flowing through emotion dysregulation, should we just target that? Like, clearly, if we can bolster emotion regulation, maybe we'll undermine the burden of minority stressors. And you see work similar to this in by Colleen Sloan, Gillian Shippard, others doing work with DBT with the trans community. I know that there's some DBT and compassion work being planned by some colleagues in Portugal right now as well. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, ACT. There have been a handful of small trials, although many of them, including my own I list here, skewed toward those living with HIV, and then an adaptation of Barlow's Unified Protocol done by John Pachankis. This was that first RCT I mentioned before that specifically targets minority stress and incorporated experts in the field to provide feedback on what would be needed for sexual minority clients. So increasingly, though, researchers have noticed that minority stress or emotion dysregulation isn't the only target, that we should really think about all of those points of bias in the minority stress model as meaningful targets for psychotherapy or for intervention. I think it's also worth noting for a moment what's missing. What stood out to you as missing? Because when I think about it, and again, I'm speaking from a US context, the first thing I note is race. That we know that these experiences differ in the context Black, Indigenous, or other person of color who's also a sexual or gender minority. And when we look at differences observed by race, we know that white cisgender participants often deny systemic bias to themselves. Even if an objective rater is looking at bias that individual is encountering and disagree and say, no, no, you are being subjected to homophobia or transphobia. Also known as sexual and gender minority POC, people of color, better identify systemic bias, but intersectional themes don't generally appear in the model. And I recently worked on a paper with some colleagues. I won't get in depth into it today, but we don't have great measures either for looking at how these blend together. But I do think it's worth just considering for a moment before we move past this model, what would need to be in it to capture intersectional themes. So what I've added are that I think in addition to internalized stigma, we need to also have internalized stigma that's based on the unique stereotypes, race-based sexual and gender minority stereotypes. We want, in addition to an expectation of rejection, the anticipation of racism when you're a part of the sexual and gender minority community. And I add to this sexual racism. So sexual racism is the idea that you might be excluded or fetishized based on your race when you're in queer and trans spaces. In addition to outness or concealment, I would add, what does concealment mean in the context of your communities? So perhaps you're out at work or you're out in the broader world, but when you're in spaces that are specific to your racial or ethnic group, perhaps you're not quite as out, or perhaps you conceal your identity. What can we say there? In addition to misgendering, there are added microaggressions when we consider phenomena like misogynoir, which is a word coined to refer to the specific type of racialized sexism encountered by Black women. And there are other types of gendered misogyny or gendered transphobia that could also be considered here. And then I mentioned previously, for example, that while when we look at the entire sexual and gender minority community, gender minority individuals encounter more violence. But then within that, and with sexual minorities as well, individuals of color experience greater violence. When we talk about community connection as a buffer, are you also connected with other queer and trans people that are part of your community of color? And do you have opportunities? Do you have places in your life where you can take pride in your entire identity? So I think these are all things that if you're working with clients who are also people of color, I would keep in mind, I would want to be aware of. It's also important to note, so Elon Meyer, who had popularized this, recently weighed in a special issue of Archives of Sexual Behavior, where there was discussion about targeting some of these factors, specifically for psychotherapy or for intervention. And he cautions us and says, psychotherapy that targets internalized problems is risky for us as a field and for how we talk about it. Because at the end of the day, these are social problems. It's society that is anti-LGBT. It's society that spreads messages about LGBT people behaving certain ways, feeling certain ways, and promotes discrimination. So when we get into the habit as psychologists of targeting internalized problems and targeting the ways that those have been turned inward, we run the risk of forgetting that these are not our client's fault, and that these come from an external source. So as attempts grow to think about this, it might be helpful to think, how am I counterbalancing my practice? Or am I approaching my practice in a way where I'm being mindful of, and perhaps even taking direct action toward or engaging in activism that's intended to tackle those societal sources of bias? Because at the end, we're putting a bandage on a wound that society caused. So now we've set the stage. Let's talk for a little bit about process-based CBT and how we respond to minority stress. So what is process-based CBT? So this is a term that's arisen in the research literature recently in the literature to emphasize a shift away from the use of manualized treatments and back to thinking about a functional analysis, and back to thinking about, what does all of the data we've accumulated in recent decades tell us about core biopsychosocial processes presented by a client that have corresponding therapeutic interventions. For example, if a client came into my office and they complain of rumination, or I identify that as one of the key drivers of their symptoms, I know, for example, that one place we could go with that is that I could introduce mindfulness interventions, that mindfulness may reduce that ruminative quality. Now, does it matter if that rumination is driven by rumination over guilt and shame from the past, as we see in depression, or about terrible things that may happen, as we see in anxiety, or terrible things that have happened, as we may see in trauma? Not really. There's a certain way, simplifying, certainly there are a number of novel guidelines that have been coming out in recent years around how we do trauma-informed introductions of mindfulness work. But as a principle, as a basic intervention, we're really talking about the same thing. So this is what I mean by process-based CBT. And I think it's helpful to take that approach, to think about, when are there common factors that we're aware of, and when are there common therapeutic interventions that correspond to it, to think about what it looks like to tackle minority stress from a process-based lens. So one way is, we certainly could, as I mentioned, target emotion dysregulation. We know, so when I talk about emotion dysregulation, I'm thinking about ineffective or maladaptive responses to strong, particularly negative affect. It's a universal mechanism. We know that having poor emotion regulation skills contributes to a variety of behavioral disorders. It's associated with almost any diagnosis or symptom we could think of. And we know that it's most elevated on average, or that it is elevated on average among sexual and gender minority people. So therapeutic responses like labeling emotions, exploring their functional impact, self-soothing skills that you see across both the Pachenkas model as well as Colleen Sloan's work with DBT, all of these we'd expect to be helpful. When we think about rejection sensitivity, this starts to get more nuanced when we start to look at these unique anti-LGBT forms of bias and their manifestation. So rejection sensitivity is this expectation others will respond to our sexual orientation or gender identity with rejection. It includes with it a common behavioral response of interpreting ambiguous signs on the part of another as rejection. So you can imagine, of course, if you've been trained to have more of a flat affect, or be a blank slate when you're working with therapy clients, that this is going to be challenging for your clients, or be experienced as rejecting by them. It was established as a transdiagnostic risk factor across a number of studies. So we know that rejection sensitivity contributes to depression, to anxiety, and therapeutic responses could include exploring the interpersonal patterns of behavior, reinforcing disclosure and vulnerability in a session, and practicing new behaviors outside of session. We also know that it can be strongly impacted through improving the parental relationship, through Gary Diamond's work, which is more attachment-based. I think one of the most powerful tools we have for thinking about rejection sensitivity within our behavioral framework is functional analytic psychotherapy. This is a therapeutic, functional analytic psychotherapy centers the therapeutic relationship as an important place where change can happen. Therapist disclosure of their own status as a gender or sexual minority is something that's been found in older studies to be associated with an improved relationship. There is certainly not similar research to suggest that if you're cisgender or heterosexual that you should make a point to disclose your identity. We also know from some literature and from studies conducted in the US that sexual and gender minority clients may express a preference for cognitive behavioral therapies over other types of therapy. This may be in part due to some of the history of psychopathologization that's associated with dynamic approaches. But we also know that that clients report that they don't want a therapy necessarily that only focuses on their sexual or gender identity. They want they want a therapist who's going to walk that line, interacting with them, of exploring with them whether or not different experiences are related to their sexuality or gender, and going from there. It's also been noted that if you yourself are a part of the community, then disclosing your experiences could serve a very important role in modeling and normalizing common experiences to your client. So while we would expect that our heterosexual cisgender clients will have experiences related to dating, to life transitions modeled by parents, by older family members, for our sexual and gender minority clients, they might not have someone like that in their life. And so you as the therapist would be the person who's able to share that with them. I wanted to touch just an added moment on what functional analytic psychotherapy is, because for how I conceptualize minority stress work, it's so important. So this is a neo-Skinnerian approach that simply applies the rules of functional analysis to a therapeutic relationship. It's a close cousin of ACT, and it was developed in part as an attempt to understand master clinicians. So those therapists whose clients come to them and not only improve or experience a reduction in symptoms, but actually thrive. It considers the in-the-moment reinforcement of natural closeness-generating behaviors as the core task of the therapist. So every time there's a vulnerable opening and we're able to genuinely and naturally respond and reinforce it, that's what allows our clients to relearn safety in a world where, as a queer or trans person, they may not have had that experience before. CRBs and FAP refer to clinically relevant behaviors. So FAP splits them into ones and twos. A helpful way to think about it is this a behavior that would interfere with closeness in a relationship or would facilitate it happening? So in terms of those things that interfere with it, a limited or unskilled ability to label your emotions or tracking what's happening is definitely something that's common among SGM clients. Concealing emotional responses. Certainly, if you're used to concealing your sexuality, you may develop some broader habits of concealing your emotional responses to things going on. And avoidance or self-censoring thoughts or experiences that bring attention to your gender identity or your sexual orientation. In terms of those that bring warmth to the relationship, we have labeling emotions, feelings, or values with accuracy, being transparent about your boundaries and needs, and an open reciprocal expression of emotions, including talking about things that are going on or that you're feeling related to your gender, to your sexual orientation, to attractions happening. And then finally, shame. I think that shame is one of the most important areas as well, and this, of course, overlaps with that interpersonal work. Uh, when we think about our sexual and gender minority clients, I don't have much time to get into microaggressions, for example. But when you consider those small moments of bias, those casual types of bias we label microaggressions, one of the common themes that's unique compared to other minority groups that sexual and gender minorities encounter is that the microaggressions often attack our psychological selves. Microaggressions about sexual and gender minorities are often involves comments implying that perhaps we're psychologically troubled, that we have bad relationships with our parents, that we may have been molested. So these are the sorts of things that add to, or can add to, the experience of shame in day-to-day life. So shame we conceptualize as that affective response to the self. This isn't about what I did, but about, am I as a person truly lovable? This is accompanied by painful self-critical thoughts, perfectionism, difficulty feeling safe in relationships. Historical patterns of family or interpersonal rejection are pretty common among sexual and gender minority people. And early life shaming or rejection experiences may put clients at particular risk. There was this phenomenal study by Marcela Matos, Sergio Carvalho, and colleagues done a few years back, where they were looking at men who were either gay or straight identified, who were diagnosed with or being treated for chronic depression. And they asked them about early life shame experiences. They found that while there were a variety of sources of shame that the heterosexual men had experienced, that the gay men had an abundance of experiences by a paternal figure, a father, a grandfather, presumably many of those shameful experiences involving their gendered behavior. So these are the types of histories our clients are coming with. Therapeutic responses, for those of you who have taken or have studied or done work in compassion training, often involve mixing mindfulness, self-soothing, exposure to fears around receiving compassion from the self, from others, or emotional repair work with rejecting parents. There are a growing number of studies in this area, so it appears to buffer the effects of bias for sexual and gender minority adolescents across racial groups. It may specifically buffer against the impact of internalized stigma, so internalized homophobia or transphobia, and its relationship with psychological well-being, perhaps because it softens those self-critical thoughts. And I took part in a study, actually co-led the compassion training groups that Jessica Simonetti is currently writing up, and that will be out later this year, looking at compassion cultivation training, which is an 8-week meditation-based model of compassion training with a racially diverse group of sexual and gender minority people. So this is the vision that I kind of came to present today and to talk about, of as our field talks about process-based integration. I think it's important to consider communities like sexual and gender minority people, where we have a pretty large body of work that tells us what the areas are for exploration, that have defined for us what are the internal events, the private behaviors, the public behaviors that go along with aspects of minority stress. And can we bring that same critical functional analytic lens that our behavioral traditions train us in, to better explore these moments and to better craft therapies for our clients, so that we might come up with something that's a step beyond or a step more advanced than simply affirmative practice. So with that, I want to just note that for future directions, we have really strong foundations in the literature identifying what are the underlying mechanisms, what are treatment targets, who are the highest needs populations. In terms of advancing sexual and gender minority treatments, we should be thinking intersectionally and assess disparate effectiveness across identities. Maybe there are needs that are more common for gender minority clients than there rather than for sexual minority clients, or vice versa. Perhaps someone who's also identified as a cisgender woman requires different places for therapy to emphasize or start than those who identify as men. We also want to think about ways that gender minority stress may have some different targets that we can continue to treat. So, for example, there's a literature that's just beginning, studies just coming out suggesting that the burdens of complex trauma, particularly related to betrayal and rejection, may be higher among gender minority than sexual minority individuals. These may offer targets where we can start to think about treatment, or when we think about interoceptive awareness, as opposed to, or in contrast with gender dysphoria. How do these play out when we think about emotion regulation and learning to look at our emotions in the body? So at this point, the recording will be drawing to a close, and I will be joining you live with a translator shortly to answer questions or respond to any comments that you have as the talk has come to an end. Thank you.